Hello everyone, welcome to my guide on how to use my DC20 damage calculator. And I'm going to go over a few different sections on why to use it, how to read it, and a little bit of the tricks that you can use with this. But I think the important thing to start is a question I got in my last video, which is why should you even use this kind of damage calculator? What's the point of it? And I think that's a very fair question, so I want to start out with that. And I think there's mainly two really good uses for using a damage calculator like this. The first is if you're trying to design features, it's really useful to be able to know how strong a feature is compared to another, right? And know it's more or less how much damage you're expecting to come out of that feature or from that buff, right? So what you can do is you can change these values to show how maybe the feature overall or the kind of attack you're using is going to affect the damage. Now, some features are a lot more complicated to try to calculate the damage of and are not as clean as just seeing if the attack does more damage. But sometimes you can sort of compare that for attacks. Things like giving advantage to an attack or just simply adding more damage straight up, right? All these things you can kind of see more or less what the increase in the average damage is going to be. Okay, another big way to use this is, and I think the way most people are probably going to use this, is if you're trying to optimize a character, right? Say that you're going to build some kind of character and you have a couple of choices to make, right? Do you want feature A or feature B, right? Which one's going to give me a little bit more damage, right? Which, even if you're, have the same character, and you might be wondering, okay, well, out of these two options, right, which one is better in combat, right? Which attack pattern might be better? That's often a very common question. Is it better for me to do, one attack and just try to do, regular attack and then an attack at disadvantage, use an AP to cancel out that disadvantage? Or is it better for you to just try to do an attack and then another attack and then another attack, right? Getting increasingly stronger disadvantage, right? So you can kind of answer questions like these using the calculator and sort of comparing how strong the different damages of the attacks are, right? What you're expecting to get. So that's the rough idea of why you'd want to use the calculator. So let's go ahead and assume that you're sold. You want to use the calculator. Let's talk a little bit about how to use this calculator. And I think the cleanest place to start is up in the top right over here. See, I have this area here for defense or PD or MD range. Basically, this calculator is going to show you the average damage that you're supposed to get on a range of PD values, right, or MD values. So the idea is, if you're choosing which attack is better, you want to know not just if it's better against an enemy with 12 PD, but also you want to know if is it better generally from the range of 8 to 18 or any other kind of PD range. And so what you can do is you can go ahead and play around with this defense range depending on the level of the enemies that you're fighting, how specific of a range you're interested in, right? I chose 8 to 18. I'm probably going to have that be the default when you open up the calculator because I think that's the most common ranges of PDs you're ever going to encounter. You're probably not going to fight anything with less than 8 PD or even MD, and you're probably not going to fight anything with more than 18 PD or MD, especially at level 1. You can mess around with the maximum. This is a pretty high value, and you're probably not going to run into anything like this, but it's still worth kind of just, having a little bit of the higher ranges just in case. I think 16 is a much more reasonable maximum. And the nice part about this is that we have this graph here, and we'll talk about that later, but it'll automatically update. All the data here is going to just show you what matters from the range that you picked, right? A little note, by the way, is that there is a limit, sort of 25 options. So if I try to pick the longest possible option here, so I can, go from up to 39, and I can even technically start as low as 6. This is a huge range, the biggest range possible, of 34 different values. The graph is totally going to support that, but this table at the bottom can only fit 25 entries. So you're only going to see from 6 to 30 here. So if you're trying to test more than 25 values, maybe do it by pieces, just do the lower range first. But I don't think you should ever really have to measure anything from 6 to 39. You're probably not going to wonder what your average damage is from a defense this low to a defense this high, right? There's no real strong practical situation where that matters. All right, and so that covers the idea with this defense category here, right? You can just leave it at 8 to 18 or maybe even 16. That's kind of a matter of, personal preference. This is probably, to be honest, a little bit more realistic about the PDs you're encountering. Even 16 is pretty high, but 8 is also a little bit low, right? You're probably going to see 12 to 10 maybe. Those are probably the most common PD values. MD is kind of in that same category, but it typically is a little bit lower. So, 8 or 9 to 11. All right. And all those numbers, by the way, are for like level 1. You're probably not going to, the levels keep scaling the defenses. So, just imagine that you're adding combat mastery to both of those. So keep track of that. So let's then talk about the attacks themselves, because I think that's where most people are focused when they're looking at this, right? You could just never touch this defense column and that doesn't really change anything. So let's focus in on one attack here first. We'll look here at attack 1. So I have a bunch of different options to pick from. And the idea is we're basically going in and putting in the information of the attack I'm talking about, right? So in this case, I'm looking at attack 1. It's saying it's got 2 base damage. I got my roll type, which means it's either, I can choose drop the drop down here. You'll see I have disadvantage 3 all the way to advantage 3, right? That's what I have right now in the calculator. I don't feel the need to add more. This is mainly where you're going to see things be in the game. If you attack 4 times in a turn, that's going to be disadvantage 3 on the last attack. If it's a lot worse than that or a lot better than that, it's not that huge of a difference. You'll see that the advantages keep getting smaller and smaller changes as you get greater advantages or greater disadvantages. Then we got the to hit, or the to hit bonus. Maybe I'll add the word bonus in there. So the to hit bonus is going to sort of be, what it is in the game. Typically this is just going to be prime plus your combat mastery, but the reason I have it here as a variable option is because of things like versatile or flanking, right? If you want to compare an attack with versatile, and we'll probably do that later when I want to get to an example, then that would be 6 instead of 4, right? Because we're adding that +2 from versatile rather than just the +4 we would normally have. So that's the to hit, and it also is sort of a way to represent higher level of play. Things at higher level scale pretty much the same. So if I just increase my attack by 2 and I increase the range of defenses I'm looking at by 2, that's not really going to change the numbers in here. All right, then is the reason I really made this this whole calculator, and this is where a lot of the extra cells I had to add to make the math work come in, which is for help die, and specifically the fact that I have the ability to add 2 help die here. So you're familiar with giving the help action. That means I add a D8 to my roll, and I choose whatever, I add that to whatever the outcome of the roll is, right? So I can add that here. I can add the D8, but I wanted players to be able to choose and sort of play around with multiple help die. So if I added another D8, right, that would represent me rolling 2d8 from the help die and then seeing what the outcome of that is. So a very useful feature, but also very niche. It's very difficult to put it into a calculator, and for the most part, you shouldn't be counting attacks as if you always have help die. It's a useful comparison for maybe a niche one-off situation, but you shouldn't really make the assumption that you're always going to have the help die unless there's some kind of feature that's going to grant it to you. Then we got some of these little bonuses here. Impact, Monk Bear Stance, and Orc Brutal Strikes. Now, Impact is pretty straightforward. If you get a heavy hit, it adds 1 to your damage. Monk Bear Stance is similar. If you get a heavy hit, you add 1 to your damage, but it's a little bit more nuanced in that it also works on a crit. So let's say an attack is a crit, but it's not a heavy hit, it still gets Monk Bear Stance, but it wouldn't get Impact. And Orc Brutal Strikes is similar to Monk Bear Stance, but instead of being a heavy hit or a crit, it's on a brutal hit or a crit. So all these are separate options. For the most part, you're probably going to ignore especially Monk Bear Stance and Orc Brutal Strikes, and you can probably ignore Impact in a lot of situations, but people really like running Impact on weapons. It's a pretty strong feature. And to add on to that, we have sort of the spell option here, which is half on miss. There's currently no martial type abilities that do half on a miss. Maybe they'll exist at some point, but for now, that's really just a spell option. And so you can select yes or no. If you add yes, it's going to do the damage as if you get half damage on a miss. And that obviously is not going to count on a critical miss because spells don't do any effect on a critical miss. So it's essentially, we can think about it as a non-critical miss. Then we have the options here that are related to the enemy. Now, I was tempted to put these into this defense category here, but the reason I chose to put things like enemy damage resistance, enemy resistance, and enemy vulnerability into the attack categories is because I wanted you to be able to play around with, what if I did this attack and I had one damage type and an attack with another damage type, right? So that way they're not all going to compare using the same damage resistance, and damage reduction, my bad, enemy resistance and vulnerability, right? So you can play around with each of these and see, okay, what would happen. I'm using the short-term DR for damage reduction, so that's both MDR and PDR. Most commonly it's going to be PDR in the game, but there are some instances of MDR. And so that's really what an attack has, right? There's a bunch of these different options, and most of the time you're probably just going to play around with these top three. Now, the ones on the bottom are all relatively niche, but they come up in some situations, so you can kind of think about these three at the top as being sort of the bread and butter of how you do the calculations. And all three of these attacks are going to have the same options. So you can independently for each of these choose, well, what if I wanted to compare this one to this one, and we'll do a little example later. You can kind of use each of these attacks separately, put in their own information. In fact, I even have these little options here at the bottom for combinations. So the idea is, well, what if I think, I know attack 1 is really strong, right? But I want to know if attack 1 is actually stronger than using both attack 2 and 3, right? Well, in that case, what I do is I say, okay, well, combination 1 is going to represent combining attack 2 and attack 3. And essentially what this is going to do is it's going to add up both of them. You'll see it'll add a little line here on the graph, and it'll add this little bit here on the table as well at the bottom. And so you can kind of get an idea of, okay, well, how much stronger are each of these options, right? And so is it better to use just attack 1, or is it better to use the combination of both? Okay, so a combination 2 just does the same thing, but there's just another option to do so in case you wanted to use it. Now, there is one caveat I wanted to note about working with this in the graph, and this gets a little bit to being able to read the data and knowing what this information actually means, which I'm going to talk about. But the idea here is that you should always start with the stuff at the top and then add new options at the bottom. What happens is, let's say I don't put in combination 1 and I'm just going to use combination 2. The graphs on Excel's not on Google Sheets not very smart, and so it's just going to pick the next color down. And so in this case, I put in the information for combination 2, but it's not going to use that color, that little sort of purple color there. It's instead going to use the yellow color that matches combination 1. So as a keynote, if you just want to have things make sense, just try to have it flow so that you pick things at the top and then something at the bottom. All right, so that kind of covers messing around with the attacks. Let's talk a little bit about how to actually read what's going on here on this graph. Or actually, I'm going to touch one more note about this. I think this is a cool feature I added for this one too. Each of these attacks have these little boxes with the names on the top, and these are fully customizable. So if I wanted to compare attack 1 to something else, and I don't want to have to remember what is attack 1, what is attack 2. Well, I can say attack 1 is my fist, and I can say attack 2 is my sword, right? And if I do that, everything in the rest of the calculator is going to use those names, right? So now the graph is going to reference fist and sword. The combination options are also going to reference fist and sword. Even the table down here, that little chart, is going to reference fist and sword. So you can go ahead and change the names of those as you want. I'm going to have the defaults always say attack 1 and attack 2. So when you kind of make a copy of this calculator, it's always going to use these names. But for the sake of making it intuitive and easy, making it nice on the graph, you can change the names as you want in these boxes specifically. So don't try to change the names anywhere else. Change them right here. All right, so let's keep it with attack 1 and attack 2 just for the sake of understanding how to read this. It's a graph, so we have our x-axis going side to side here. This is going to tell us the enemy's defense, right? So each of these values is our defense values. So in this case, we start with the lowest one, which is 8, and all the way here to 16. And we say, okay, well, this is everything, all the values that match up for the defense of 11, right? We'll just say it's PD for the sake of, explaining it. So in this case, we can see, okay, the PD here for green, and if you scroll over, it will show you the value. So we can see, the PD for green, that's a 0.75 there. The damage value is 0.75 for 11 PD. The damage value is 1.45 for 11 PD for attack 2. and then for attack 1, we can see it's 2.15 at 11 PD. So you can kind of go through, you don't have to actually scroll through and see the numbers, and we'll talk about that's what the table's for really, to make it easy on you, but you can look it out on the graph too. And so this is the way you're kind of looking at it, and the average damage is representing this concept of, let's say I made attack 1 100 times, 1,000 times, right? In theory, almost an infinite amount of times, right? And I averaged up all that damage, right? How much damage am I typically doing, right? That's kind of the question. That's the number we're going to see here, right? So the idea is here, for example, right, attack 3 is a 0 damage attack, meaning it's only really going to do attacks on a heavy hit. It's only really going to do damage on a heavy hit or higher. Well, we can see that here for 11 PD, we're going to be doing 0.75 damage on average, which means we're not always doing exactly 0 damage, right? Sometimes we're getting a heavy hit, sometimes we're getting a critical hit, and all those things factor into the average damage, right? So that's why a weapon with a base damage of 0 isn't going to have an average damage of 0. It's actually going to be a little higher than that because it has these heavy hit chances, these critical hit chances. All right, so this is how you read the graph. If someone's familiar with reading graphs, it should be pretty intuitive. I kind of over-explained it just in case someone's not familiar with reading graphs, because I wanted this calculator to be very easy to use for people who aren't super confident with math. And in fact, this is partially why I included this table down here. It's up to whatever seems easier for you to understand and sort of get the gist of what's happening. And so the table down here is giving you the same information as the graph is, although it can only go up to 25 entries, like I said before. And the idea is we match it up here too, right? So here's my defense of 11. Okay, well, attack 1, that's the sort of this reddish color. Attack 1 does 2.15 damage on average at 11 PD. Okay. And then attack 2 does 1.45. Okay. And then attack 3 is 0.75. All right, cool. And that's the idea. You're looking through, and it's pretty quick to say, this number is bigger than this number. That means at 11 PD, attack 1 is better than attack 2. All right, so that's the idea, right, with reading the graph and reading the table, right? If you wanted to remove attacks from the graph and the table, right, it's actually relatively easy. There's two options here, and I actually think one of them works better than the others. So one option that can be a little bit messy is to simply just put a letter into the damage. So the damage, I'm allowing literally anything to be typed in here, and that's because you could just type S, not really a damage number, right? But you'll see that it'll remove attack 3 from all of these. So you don't see attack 3 in here anymore, and you don't see attack 3 in here anymore. The only issue with this is that it skips that option, right? So if I try to go with the combination now, it's going to steal attack 3's color. So just keep in mind, if you remove an option, right, like if I choose to remove attack 3, don't go ahead and add a combination, right? If you remove attack 2, for example, don't use attack 3. Always try to use the stuff on the top first and then work your way down, just because the graph makes that look nicer. This should still work fine either way. Okay, so let's go back and add a little damage number. We'll say 0. Another option you could have to kind of hide the numbers, if you wanted to still have attack 1 and attack 2 in a combination, is instead to just slam the resistance really high, right? So I can make the resistance 10, and that basically means I'm never doing damage. And the result of that is, look at this line. There's actually a little green line right here at the bottom, and that represents the fact that actually at all points of these PDs, attack 3 is actually going to do 0 damage, right? So it'll still show up here on the graph as 0, and it still does show up here on the table as 0, and it still shows up on the graph also as 0, and it still says attack 3 in here. So it doesn't fully hide it. It's still, you can still see the name over here and the color of the graph over here, but it doesn't mess up adding new entries. So you can go ahead and choose whichever one seems easiest to you. Putting a letter into the damage box works fine most of the time. Okay, cool. So this is the basic idea of how to read the damage calculator, right? Mainly, I liked including the graph. I think it's very easy and visually appealing. I think people can very easily look at a graph and say, look, this one is just always better, right? This red line is always on top of the other two lines, which means it has to be a better option, right? But not always, right? Sometimes there's situations where things will flip-flop, right? One option is going to be better at a certain range, and then another option better at another range. And I'm going to use an example here to test, sort of to show off, how to use this calculator, why I'd want to use this calculator, and sort of how I'd go about using the calculator myself. So I'm going to answer a sort of common question, which is, let's say I can have the choice, right? I have two hands, and I have a couple of options with the custom weapon system. So let's compare the option of using a heavy two-handed weapon and a versatile weapon, right? So let's go ahead. We're going to use a heavy weapon here for the red one. So I'm going to say heavy. And then over here, I'm going to say, oh, well, what if I was using a versatile weapon? Okay. And for the sake of this, I'm just going to, you can type in any random letter in here. Okay. So we can see the graph is color-coded. Heavy is doing better than versatile, but that's a lie. I haven't actually gone and fixed the numbers yet, right? So heavy should do 2 base damage, and I'm going to use a regular roll for both of them, +4 to hit. Cool. So this is all the right information for heavy. Versatile is 1 base damage. The roll is still regular. I don't want to compare advantage to non-advantage unless I have a reason to, but the to hit is going to be 6. Okay, so now we can see, right, that these two are kind of a little closer, right? Versatile is not that far behind of heavy, and we can see here on the damage numbers, okay, yeah, right, this is only a little bit higher, right? There's about 0.4 here. There's about a 0.4 difference here. So, the difference, it varies. There's a bigger gap between the two of them at low PD values than high PD values. I could even at this point say, well, I wonder if it changes at some point, right? So let's say I wanted to add everything up to 24 defenses, right? Oh, okay, look, right, the gap kind of closes until 23 PD, which is absurd. You're probably not going to fight an enemy with 23 PD at level 1, so that's sort of an unreasonably high defense value. But you can see, okay, at that point, right, we can look at it here. They have the exact same damage, right? So at 23, at a defense of 23, right, PD, because we're talking about weapons, heavy and versatile weapons are actually the same. You'll get the same damage from either one, so it doesn't really matter. And then we see, okay, well now versatile is actually 0.05 damage better, right? So not a huge difference, right? But still a little bit better. It edges out a bit. But one other thing we can talk about is, okay, well, but I'm not just going to use regular heavy and versatile weapons. I'm going to use impact heavy and versatile weapons. So we just go ahead and slap that into the calculator. I say, okay, well, I want heavy, I want impact to be added to the heavy one, and I want impact to be added to versatile. Okay, now you can see the gap is closed a little bit more, right? That little extra bonus to hit from versatile is making impact just that much better, right? And so we can see, okay, well now, right, these gaps are a little bit smaller between this, right? At 16, we only have about a 0.1 difference, a 0.1 difference here, right? This gap kind of stays closer. In fact, here I can go back to that increased defense of 24, and we can see a little bit of this weird bouncing back and forth, right? And this mainly has to do with our chance to get things like heavy hits and brutal hits and beyond brutal hits. So we'll see it actually kind of bounces back and forth between which one's better, but mainly it's pretty close between the two of them. They're more or less tied. So this is pretty much an example of how you're going to use this as a regular user, right? This is enough information for most people. You're not going to need anything more than this. But I know I have some nerds in my audience, including me, so I decided to add a little bit of extra bits here for people who want the extra nerdiness. One of them, and I'm probably going to start with the second bit here, is that this graph can be a little small sometimes on some screens, and it does this annoying thing where if I try to scroll in, it'll sort of mismatch itself. So I can try to make it bigger, and align it, but as I scroll out, it might start to cover the little word of defense here. So I typically keep it smaller than it needs to be so that when you scroll in and scroll out, it doesn't mess everything up. But an alternative is I popped it out into another tab. So if you look down here, there's these different tabs. I got inputs for the nerds. We'll talk about that in a second, and graph. And so I can just click on graph, and what it'll do is it'll show me the whole graph on one big page. So it'll pop out the whole thing, and I can look at the graph in more detail. I can take a screenshot of it if that's what you want to do. It's more of like a nice, well-presented graph, and you don't have to worry here about scrolling in or scrolling out. Okay, let's talk about this for the nerds tab. So remember, I'm doing this comparison with heavy impact weapon and a versatile impact weapon. So I'll go ahead and go here. I'm actually going to title them that. I'm going to title this heavy impact. Oh, not with a capital M. And I'm going to title this versatile impact. All right, barely makes it inside of the box. All right, then we go to Fortin and the Nerds, and this is more than you ever really need to know for the most part, but it's here for the people who really want it. It's here for those nerds that want to use it. So here's the representation of this. So here I've got our average damage for the 3 of my attacks. This attack does nothing. This is still going to show me random information. These are not made to sort of immediately adjust themselves based on what's input here. You kind of need to, take this stuff here with a grain of salt. I might flesh it out to be a little bit better in the future. But right now, if you're looking at this, you're nerdy enough to know, okay, these are the only things I'm interested in, right? So what I can see, I'm going to zoom this in so that it's a little bit closer. This is what the whole look is like. If I zoom it in too closely, you won't see the very end of it. So I'm going to zoom back out later for that to show up. Okay, so if we look closely, it still shows me all the defense values. So here I'm reading it across. Everything on this row here is for 8 defense, and everything on this row below it is for 9 defense, and etc. Right? And it's only going to show me the ranges that I care about. So I have my average damage here. I can see them. I can compare the numbers, and it does a couple other things for me. It'll show me the average damage for the whole range. So over here I can say, oh, okay, over this entire range of 8 to 16 defense, right, the average damage of all those is 2.372 repeating, right? Okay. And if I take the average damage of all the versatile impact, that's about 2.15 repeating. This is very niche. I doubt you're really going to want this information. This can be very useful if you're trying to create a feature, right? If you're trying to create a feature and balance it, then this might be what you're using that for. But mainly, I just put it in here because it fits in here and someone might want it, so I went ahead and added it. Over here, we have the hit chance, right? So what is the chance to hit at all these defense values, right? We'll see that versatile impact has a better chance to hit across the board. And we'll see I took the average again, right? So what's the average chance to hit out of all of these? Well, about here, it's about 0.65, which makes sense. It should be the middle value here. And here it's 0.75, which also makes sense. It should be the middle value here. Okay, cool. So that's the idea, is we can compare the hit chance and then the same thing for heavy chance and brutal chance, right? And crit chance, although crit chance is pretty much always going to be the same as long as 2 rolls are the same. So as long as I'm comparing a regular roll to a regular roll or an advantage roll to an advantage roll, the crit chances will be the same. And so we can see one of the benefits of versatile impact is, let's say you're a barbarian, right? You get stamina back from being able to get heavy hits, right? Well, now you can look at this from the point of view of being a barbarian and say, okay, well, I mean, the average damage is pretty close, but I also get this little increase to my heavy chance, right? I get a 40% heavy chance here. I get a 50% heavy chance here, right? These are written down as little proportions, not as percents. If you want to change that, you can go and click these boxes and then eventually ask for them to be percents. But currently, I like having them as proportions. That's how I like looking at these numbers. And so we can see, okay, great. Here's the individual values. We can see my heavy chance is always 0.1 greater, right, or 10% higher, a 10% chance more than the heavy impact weapon. And the brutal chance is the same. The brutal chance is going to talk about all brutals. So the idea is that in the game, you can get a brutal hit, you can get a brutal 1 or a brutal 2, you can get beyond brutal. There's no real name for this, but basically when you roll a 15 or higher above, which is rare in most circumstances, right? That's also going to be grouped up into the brutal chance. Okay. The last little bit of this is this little last section over here to the right. And I'm going to zoom back out so you can see it more easily, which is going to show you which one is the best option, right? So over here, it's color-coded, and it'll show you, okay, for average damage, which one is winning out. And we can see here, oh, heavy impact is the winner, right? The best option here is heavy impact for everything, for average damage, right? So average damage is just saying which one's got the best damage out of all these options, right? Right now, it's really only comparing attack 1 and attack 2, or heavy impact and versatile impact. Hit chance, heavy chance and brutal chance all do the exact same thing. So we can see, well, the damage is better for impact, but the chance to hit is going to be better, or the chance to get a heavy is going to be better for versatile as well, right? So We can see these. I need to fix this. I think this is just doing a little bit of weird math here because I removed the attack 3. But the idea is, right, we're going to look at this. We're going to choose, we're going to see this as the way of saying, oh, well, which one's going to be the best? And we can see if there's a tie, it'll just get this white box that says no winner, meaning that there's going to be some kind of tie. It'll tell you if there's a full tie. If there's a 3-way tie, it'll show that off as no winner. If there's a 2-way tie, then it'll say, oh, heavy impact and versatile impact, which is going to probably fill up the whole box and not show up very well. All right, so this section here is really for the people who want to nerd out very specifically to the numbers, and I honestly don't think people are going to really need it. I just added it for the sake of having something like that, but this is really where you're going to be able to do most of the calculations. And that about wraps up everything I wanted to cover with the damage calculator. I don't really have anything else I wanted to talk about. I'm going to put probably a link to this video in this area here, so that when you get the calculator, you can always open up this video. And that is just about everything that there is to say. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoy this calculator, and until the next time, have the best time.